Hello everyone. So we are in video 6, and I apologize. I think in the last video I kept saying that the next video was video 5, but that was actually video 5, so I apologize for that. So video 6 has 3 pieces to it. We're going to talk about dependents, okay? We're going to talk about filing status, and then we're going to answer one question on the basic exam. So when it comes to dependents, okay, what we have to remember is we have an umbrella requirement, okay, and then once those umbrella requirements are met, they are either a qualifying child dependent or a qualifying relative dependent or not a dependent at all, okay? So we first have to qualify the people to be considered as dependents, and then if they meet those general qualifications, then we can say, all right, are they a qualifying child? Okay. If they fail one of those tests, then are they a qualifying relative? If they fail one of those tests, then they're not dependents. Okay. And they can't be put on that person's tax return. Okay. So that's the first one we're going to look at. Okay. And then the second one is looking at filing statuses. So there are essentially 5 filing statuses for the 1040. You have single. Okay, you have married filing joint, you have married filing separate with exceptions, you have head of household with exceptions, and then we have the special status for certain taxpayers whose spouse has died. And then we call that surviving spouse or qualifying widow or widower. Okay, so I have some documents that I have prepared for all the dependent discussion and the filing status discussion. Okay, and once we're done with that, we'll go ahead and we'll answer question 5 on the basic exam. Okay, all right. So the first one I want to look at is dependents. Okay, and I have two. Let's see, qualifying. I have 2 documents. We have the qualifying child requirements and the qualifying relative requirements. Okay, so general requirements. So in order to be a qualifying person, you have to meet these requirements right here. Okay, all dependents must have an identification number, either a social security number or an ITIN or an adoption identification number, whatever happens to be, any of those are okay. All dependents must be U.S. citizens or nationals, or residents of the U.S., Canada, or Mexico for some part of the year. And all dependents who are married cannot file a joint return with their spouse unless the filing of that joint return is done solely to claim a refund of tax withheld. So they were employees, they had tax withheld, and the only reason they're filing is so they can get that back. There's nothing else on their return. Okay, that's okay, but typically dependents of another cannot file a joint return with their spouse. Okay, so as long as all those are met, then you can start saying, okay, well, what kind of a dependent might they be? Are they going to qualify as a child, or are they going to qualify as a relative? Okay, we always want to try the requirements for qualifying child first. Okay, there are 4 tests, and if they fail one of the tests, you are not a qualifying child. You can try to be a qualifying relative. If they fail one of those tests, then they aren't a dependent at all. Okay, so you try first qualifying child. If something there isn't met, then you try a qualifying relative. If one of those isn't met, then you're not a dependent. Okay, this becomes really important because we have a lot of students who come in and get their taxes filed with us, okay, because it's free and they have the time to be able to come in and do it. What we have to make sure we're asking them is, are you a dependent of another? Most of the time they know the answer. Yep, my parents are claiming me this year. Sometimes they don't know. And like I said previously, if they don't know, I make them call their family right then and there, okay, and ask the question, are you guys claiming me in 2020? And they're either going to say yes or they're going to say no, okay? Then we can move on, okay? But the main parts of this are saying, do you have dependents? Do they meet the test? In order to be a qualifying child, there are 4 tests. Relationship, age, residence or abode, same thing, and support. Okay. For a relationship, in order to qualify as a relationship for qualifying child, they either have to be the children of the taxpayers or descendants, like grandchildren and such, or the siblings of taxpayers and their descendants, nephews and nieces and such. Okay, so those, if they're one of those 2 to 3, 4 things, okay, either children or siblings of the taxpayers and descendants of either one, then they meet the relationship test for qualifying child. Basically, they've got to be younger, okay, than the taxpayer. Okay. Qualifying relative rules, that relationship test is like blown up. It's expanded. Okay, but we're only looking at children or siblings of the taxpayers and descendants of either. Okay. The age test has 3 pieces. Okay, the age test says, okay, if you are under the age of 19, you automatically meet the age test. Okay, if you are under the age of 24 and a full-time student, then you automatically meet the age test. Okay. If you are permanently and totally disabled, there's no age requirement, but it has to be documented that they are permanently and totally disabled. Okay. What does full-time student mean? It just means that you attend school full-time for at least 5 months out of the year. Okay. And time spent away from home at school is considered time at home. Okay. That's when this residence in a bold place comes back. Okay. So you can qualify under the age rule in 3 ways for qualifying child. Okay. The residence test basically says the taxpayer and the dependent must live in the same principal residence for more than 1/2 of the year, unless there is a special circumstances, like the dependent being in the military. Okay. Dependents of unmarried taxpayers. Okay. Where you have parents sharing custody. That's a different one there. Okay. When full-time students are away at school, if you have a sick child who is spending a lot of time in the hospital, okay, that counts as time at home and it satisfies the residence or the abode test. There are special circumstances where we have to look at unmarried taxpayers and when two individuals share a child, who gets to claim and stuff like that. But those are pretty special situations, and we like to deal with those one-on-one as they come through the VITA sessions. So there. Okay. The last one is support. Okay. The support test for qualifying child basically says it doesn't matter who's supporting the child, as long as more than 1/2 of their support isn't coming from the child themselves. Okay. So I have a 20-year-old daughter, okay, who is not a full-time student, so she wouldn't qualify as my dependent anyway, okay, but I don't support her financially in a major way, okay, and neither does anybody else. She supports herself. She's got her own job. She's got her own apartment. She's got her own car. She buys her own food, okay, so the support piece I would fail as well. Even though I help her out when she needs it, I don't provide more than 1/2 of her own support. Okay, but that's not the test. No one does but her. Okay, so the support test for a qualifying child basically says it doesn't matter who gives her support as long as she is not supporting herself. Okay, so that's that one there. All right, so if any one of these tests are failed, next, they aren't a qualifying child. Okay, but they could be what we call a qualifying relative. Okay. So qualifying relatives are only looked at if a qualifying child test has been failed. Okay, all of the same umbrella requirements are there. Okay, they still have to have an identification number. They still have to be U.S. citizens or nationals or residents. They still can't file a joint return normally with a spouse. Okay, there are only 3 tests for qualifying relative. Okay, the relationship test, the gross income test, and the support test. Okay, relationship is vastly expanded. Okay, it basically says there has to be some kind of a familial relationship. Okay? So, aunts, uncles, grandparents, descendants, any of those things can be in there. In-laws, all of that automatically satisfies a relationship test. Okay? If you have someone who is living with you the entire year and they aren't familial, okay, they can still be your relationship dependent for qualifying relative. They can still meet this test, okay, even if they aren't familial, as long as they live with you the entire year, okay? And this is really strange, okay? In order for a cousin to qualify for the relationship test, they have to live with you the entire year. So they fall underneath the second rule here under relationships. So they either have to have a familial relationship in some way with you, or if they're non-familial, including cousins, they have to live with you the entire year of the tax year. Okay, so 2 ways you can satisfy the relationship test for qualifying relative. Okay. The gross income test says they can't have more than a certain amount of gross income. Okay. So this one says the dependent cannot have more than $4,300 of gross income for 2020. Okay. So this is before any deductions or anything like that. Gross income means all income coming in that's not excluded. Okay. So $4,300 is the number in 2020. It's probably going to go up in 2020, 2021. Okay. I'm assuming it'll probably go up a couple $100. So in 2020, if they have more than $4,300 worth of gross income, okay, then they are not your qualifying relative. They fail it. Okay. What does gross income include for this particular test? Okay. It doesn't include non-taxable items like scholarships, non-taxable Social Security benefits, non-taxable income, stuff like that. That doesn't qualify as gross income for this particular test. Okay. So if they have non-taxable items, that doesn't count towards the gross income number. Okay. The last test here is the support test, and it's different than the qualifying child in that now we care who the support comes from. It has to come from the taxpayer. The taxpayer must provide more than half of the dependent's support. Okay. So it can't come from the dependent, but it has to come from the taxpayer. Okay. So all of those have to be met in order to become a qualifying relative. Okay. So this becomes important because of the child tax credit. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get to credits, and it becomes important with filing status to know whether or not you have a dependent. Okay, so that's those rules. One thing before we leave the dependent discussion is in your resource guide. If I can find it now. Here it is. Sorry. In your resource guide, so one of the tabs, tab C, is labeled dependents, and it has decision trees in here, and they're so nice because it just puts everything, bam, on one page. Here are some overview rules. Okay, to be a qualifying child, you have to have this. To be a qualifying relative, you have to have this. Here's more. Qualifying children of more than one person. These are things that we deal with on a return basis. Okay, dependents. Here's where you begin in determining qualifying child or qualifying relative. Okay, it's all there. So our resource guide is such a cool guide because it's smaller, and you can just flip to one page and you can start looking down. Oh yeah, they have a relative and they don't. Okay, so that's the cool thing about the resource guide and how they do that. Okay, so all right, so that concludes our discussion on dependents. So go ahead and take a break now if you want it before we start filing status. Okay, filing status. Okay, so we have 5 filing statuses, but only 4 tax rate schedules, because one filing status uses the tax rate schedule of another. And we'll get to that when we start looking at the tax rates and the schedules back down in one of the later videos here. Okay, so we've got 5 filing statuses. We have single, married filing joint, head of household, married filing separate, and qualifying widow or widower, or sometimes you hear this referred to as surviving spouse. The terms are interchangeable whenever you see them. Okay, so some of my books use qualifying widow or widower. A lot of the IRS information uses surviving spouse. It's really odd, but it is what it is. Okay, so I'm just going to start by going down this list. Okay, single individuals. Most of our folks that come into VITA are single or married filing joint. We do get head of household individuals. We do get a couple of married filing separate individuals, and trying to remember if I've ever used qualifying widow or widower. I can't tell you I have, but it's possible I maybe have done one or two of them. It's just not a widely used status. Okay? Single. Unmarried taxpayers who do not qualify to file for head of household or qualifying widow or widower status. Basically, they don't have any dependents. Okay? So single people, a lot of students are single people. Okay? Single taxpayers can have dependents, but they might not qualify to use head of household or qualifying widow or widower status. Okay? Just because you're single doesn't mean you don't have dependents. Okay? It means that if you have to use the single status, you don't qualify for a different status. Okay? So pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Okay, married filing joint basically says these are taxpayers who were legally married as of December 31st of 2020. Okay, so as of the end of the tax year, it doesn't matter when you got married. Okay, if you are married by the end of the tax year, December 31st, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. at night, you are married for the entire year. Okay, you also have to be a U.S. citizen or a resident. Right? Taxpayers are considered married and can use this status in the year a spouse dies as long as they qualified to file married filing joint while the spouse was still alive. So in the year of death of a spouse, you can still use married filing joint status. Okay. Married filing joint returns, when you file in this way, you are both liable for everything. Okay, so you are liable for all the income and the expenses reported on the tax return. You are also both liable for any of the tax liability that arises out of that tax return. And it doesn't matter who earns more or not. Okay, they are both equally liable for everything on the tax return and the tax liability that comes to be. Okay, married filing joint taxpayers don't have to have dependents. A lot of them do, but they don't have to. It could just be you and your spouse, and that's okay. Okay, so married filing joint, single statuses, those are pretty easy. When it comes down to the nitty gritty, it's these things here that are a little bit different. Okay, so head of household, okay, is typically for unmarried taxpayers who have dependents. Okay, taxpayers who are unmarried at the end of the tax years. There are exceptions for special circumstances. I'm going to talk about that down here with abandoned spouse. Okay, so typically they're unmarried at the end of the tax year, and okay, they have to be U.S. citizens or residents and not be a qualifying widower. Okay, if they're a qualifying widower, that's a better status. Okay, so they would rather use that, but they're not. Okay, and taxpayers must pay over half the cost of maintaining a home in which a dependent of the taxpayer lives for more than half the tax year. Okay, so you have to have a dependent and they have to live in your home for more than half of the tax year. There is one exception to this rule, okay, and that's for parents of a taxpayer. Okay, you still have to pay more than half the cost of maintaining a home, but that taxpayer does not have to live with you. Parents can still live in their own home as long as they are being supported by the taxpayer. Every other dependent that's not a parent has to live in the taxpayer's home for more than half of the year. That's why some people who have dependents might not qualify for head of household status, is because they aren't living there and they're not supporting them in that way. Okay, all right, so that's what head of household means. Okay, married filing separate. So this is for folks who are legally married at the end of the tax year who do not want to file a joint return with their spouse. Maybe it's because they can't find their spouse. Maybe they don't like their spouse. Maybe they don't want to be responsible for what the spouse puts on the tax return. So they decide to file their own. That's okay. I don't like the status. The status sucks because this status excludes a lot of tax benefits. Okay? It excludes a lot of deductions like education. It doesn't allow you to do a lot of credits as well. But it's available for those folks who are married but don't want to file a joint return. Okay, there is one exception to this rule. It's called the abandoned spouse exception. And this exception allows a married taxpayer to use the head of household status as long as they meet the requirements here. Okay, those requirements: taxpayer is considered legally married at the end of the tax year, and the taxpayer pays for over half the cost of maintaining a home for a dependent son or daughter. Not any dependent, a child of theirs, a dependent son or daughter, okay, who lives with the taxpayer more than half the year, and the taxpayer had to have lived apart from the spouse for the last 6 months of the year. Okay, those are all required to be able to use the abandoned spouse exception. If they don't hit those requirements, then they have to file either married filing joint or married filing separate, one or the other. Okay, so that exception has been used a couple times in the time I've been doing VITA, but not often. Okay, but it's there for those people who have been essentially abandoned by their spouse. Okay, last one here, qualifying widow or widower, also called the surviving spouse status. This status is kind of cool because as long as you meet the requirements to use it, you can use the married filing joint tax rate schedule and the married filing joint standard deduction, which is really nice because those are the best ones out there. Okay. However, your spouse had to have died, and that sucks. Okay, it's morbid. I don't like it, but they recognize that it happens. And if you have a dependent son or daughter living in the home, you might qualify for the surviving spouse or the qualifying widow or widower status. What are these requirements? First, the taxpayer has to remain unmarried at the end of the year, okay? And the taxpayer must be a U.S. citizen or resident, and the taxpayer must have qualified to file jointly while the spouse was still alive in the year of death, okay? And here's the kicker, okay? The taxpayer must have at least one dependent son or daughter living in the taxpayer's home the entire year, and the taxpayer has to be paying over half the cost of maintaining that home. Okay, so all of those have to be met, and this one's the kicker right here. You got to have a dependent son or daughter living in your home the entire year, and you have to be supporting them. Okay, when can we use this status? Okay, the qualifying widow or widower status can be used in the 2 years after death. Okay, so if so-and-so dies, spouse dies in 2015, they can file married filing joint. But in 2016 and 2017, as long as they meet the requirements, they can use the qualifying widow or widower status. Okay. After that, then it comes back to regular rules. Okay. Married filing joint, head of household, or single. So the qualifying widow or widower status is only to be used in the 2 years after the year the spouse dies, because in the year the spouse dies, okay, then they can still file married filing joint. Okay. So that's a quick rundown of the filing statuses. In your resource guide, okay, there is a tab right here, tab B for filing status. Okay. If you get past all this other stuff, there is a decision tree, yay! Where it says you just start asking questions, and most of the time you don't even have to ask a lot of these questions. You're gonna know. Okay, are you married? No. Do you have dependents? Okay. So only when we need to probe should we use the decision tree in the resource guide there. Okay, so that takes care of dependents and filing status. Okay, what I want to do now is go over to the testing booklet and go through just question 5 of basic scenario 3. This is on page 35. Okay. So we have Aiden and Sophia Duke. Aiden and Sophia are married, and they have always filed married filing joint. Aiden died in 2020 at the age of 58. Okay, Sophia, age 56, has not remarried. Aiden earned $5,000 in wages, and Sophia earned $51,000 in wages. Sophia paid all the costs of keeping up a home and provided all the support for their 2 children, who lived with her all year. Okay, Mia's 11, Oliver's 15. Sophia does not have enough deductions to itemize, but she did make a $500 cash contribution. Okay. They are all U.S. citizens with valid Social Security numbers. So 5 says, what is the most advantageous filing status allowable for Sophia in 2020? Okay. Her spouse died in 2020. They've always filed married filing joint. She's going to file married filing joint. Okay. Qualifying widow or widower is only in the 2 years after his death. Okay, and it looks like as long as she stays unmarried and those kids continue to live with her, she can go ahead and use qualifying widower status for the 2 years after his death. Okay, all right, So that's basically it for this video. There was a lot in there. If you ever have any questions, you can always go to your resource guide or you can ask me.